Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode and we have our world famous speakers for today's discussion, Mr. David Schumacher, Mr. David Smith, Mr. David Martin, Professor Rob, and Mr. Sharidan Tatsuno. First, I want to give chance Mr. David Schumacher.
Hello, Sharif. So we've had a few talks on climate change in the past. Today, I want to approach it differently than I've done before. I want to talk about some things that don't necessarily seem like they go together, at least not in the United States, and that's climate change, partisan politics, and hope. Whoever would have thought those three things would go together, right? Well, first off, let me tell you why I want to talk about the United States today. Usually, when you look at countries that rank high on the list of cumulative emissions that contribute to climate change, the United States is right there in the top, along with China and Russia, and then followed by others. And then if you go per capita, because the United States is a large place, well, it still ranks pretty high up there on the list. So clearly what's going on in the United States is affecting the world as well, along with the other players that I mentioned. So to the partisan politics side of things, Pew Research, which I'm sure people are aware of, back in 2016 did a survey on the political aspects of climate change. And here in the United States, we're divided into two parties, a conservative Republican Party and a more liberal Democratic Party. The Democratic Party have been talking about climate change for a while, and the Republicans have been talking about it quite differently. But back in 2016, the survey showed that 72%, nearly three quarters, of people that considered themselves conservative Republicans, and 39% that considered themselves moderate Republicans, said that climate change was exaggerated, that it was overrated. At the same time, only 8% of liberal Democrats and 18% of moderate Democrats said the same thing. So you can clearly see the partisan divide that existed in 2016 and has persisted for quite a while. However, just yesterday, the the House of Representatives, the lower house of the U.S. legislature, the Republican part of that, the conservative part of that, launched a six-part energy, climate, and conservation framework from which to try to build on laws. So the sixth part starts with one of my favorite topics, which is innovation, and then they talk about legal aspects such as permitting of newer, cleaner power plants, doing the same as far as for being able to clean industry, using resources that are currently available and trying to respond to supply chain issues, resiliency, mitigation, things that we can do to help communities that are suspect to more increasing floods and wildfires, and then plans to do things that others have been talking about for a while, such as planting trees and modernizing farm practices using advanced agricultural methods and biotech innovation. So hope's not necessarily in the details of this plan or plans that Democrats have put out there, but the fact that there is a plan on the two major political parties in the United States, I think leads me to a little bit of hope. That was interesting.
Thank you.
There's an uneasy parallel here of why I have some hope about this. And that uneasy parallel has to do with another subject that Democrats and Republicans have been very entrenched on in the past, and that's been over school safety and gun issues, which has been getting a lot of press. I'm sure that all across the United States is very well of what's been going on in that area and perhaps worldwide. And the fact that, as of yesterday, the Senate, which is the higher house of the legislature here in the United States, came to a deal over being able to work past these wedge issues that's been very entrenched from the gun issue. And perhaps that gives me an uneasy optimism that now that plans exist on both the Republican and Democrat side for climate change, that something can come of this too. It would be great from my vantage point to be able to see both of the political parties. This is a real world for both of the political parties to be able to have wins to take to their base and say, look, we've done good things here. And in fact, for then all of America and indirectly all of the world to be able to benefit from this. I have no illusions that in the near term we're going to fix these issues, either one of them once and for all. But perhaps we can continue to make it better and better and better. And some of this can translate into initiatives that can work in other countries as well. So there you go, Sharif. There's my opening remarks today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Mr. David Smith.
I think David did a great job of setting up a different view of looking at climate change. And when that's important when you begin to understand its impact. I mean, we've talked about climate change a lot. But, climate change is the long-term shift in the Earth's average temperature and weather patterns. And it's important to realize that climate change refers to the large-scale shift. In other words, it is a global, whole planet issue. And we've gone through, in the last 4 to 5 million years, we've gone through many ice ages, periods of tropical climate. But since the Industrial Revolution began, the average temperature has raised quite a bit. According to the UK Office of Climate Change, it's risen over 40% since then. And so we see that going. I like where David started today's discussion, because some of the effects of climate change is other than just the heat-related issues. It's more animal extinctions, more and worse forest fires, worse storms, more drought, raising sea levels, raising temperature, but also there's an economic loss. And most people don't think about the economic side and how it's going to affect us and how it's going to affect us in each of our own countries. And, why is it so difficult for the world to come together and tackle climate change? Part of it's politics. And David did a good job of describing some of the political differences in the United States, but those same type of differences and even more exist internationally. And how do you begin to get to it? Also, part of it has been a problem of information. For a long time, a major stumbling block was a failure to agree that problem existed in the first place, and whether the global temperatures were significant enough to point to a long-term global trend. Well, we've gone past that point today now. And so there is still some dispute over whether human activity was the primary responsible thing for it, whether it was agriculture, whether it was farming, whether it was other different opinions of it. And at the COP last year, we began to see what are the ways we can affect it. One of the things that has been a stumbling block in dealing with climate change is the issue of initiatives and incentives. And how do we get the governments, how do we get the commercial companies to take climate change seriously? How do we give them the boost to begin to work that way? And are there incentives to do it around a different way? And we've increasingly seen that the government action is needed to do it. But there's a new trend I've seen in the last year or so, and that is that the financial sector has begun to step up and take part of the lead in doing that. We've seen places where, for example, in the United States, the Federal Reserve Bank, the EU, and others beginning to really come back and try to address climate change, not just from a global risk against the environment, but also as a financial risk, also as a risk to the stability of countries and to the stability of the financial marketplaces. And in looking at a recent survey of CFOs from the Global 1000, the emphasis, one of the questions asked is, have you begun to present the financial risk of global climate change to your board of directors? And the answer was really about 80% have begun to do that. And I think when you begin to pull it back, not just in it's good for the environment, it's good for life and sustainability, but it's also a financial risk in there too. I think all those elements coming together will help us as we go forward. So that's my initial comments too.
Thank you, sir. Mr. David Martin.
Thank you. And being the third David to speak, I'm going to bring maybe a cold shower into the afternoon here because actually I put on normally I was wearing very short sleeve here today because I'm in Paris where the temperatures are going up extreme this week. Later in France, it'll be already in the south. It's a high heat wave coming in from North Africa for this week. So the weather forecast is extreme temperatures here in France and unusual temperatures for June. So I think climate change is already here. And I think we are just slowly waking up to the fact that we are seriously screwed and looking down a very dark vision of things going to be arriving into people's lives, into people's communities, into people's agricultural resources. And of course, the financial impact will be phenomenal because we'll have to find, like David Schumacher said, ways to mitigate this and ways to ensure against, or even just to prevent on a small level some of these tremendous changes that are going to come into our lives in the next few years. And I think one thing that we have to speak about is what's the point of talking about all this while Russia is destroying a country in Europe? And just to build that country again, all of the destruction in terms of CO2 is going to be phenomenal. So just a complete disaster for the world that we have no dialogue between the major powers at the moment to deal with these issues. What was maybe a consensus idea a few years ago with the big world forums that existed has suddenly disappeared, and it's going to be every man for himself or every country for himself. And the women and children are going to suffer, and probably in those underdeveloped countries and things where they have more impact than we can imagine for climate change. So for me, it's not a happy vision. And I'm unfortunate that I have to share that with you today. But I think Russia, in its current attitude, has really set us back. There's not going to be much dialogue between these great nations to deal with this. And unfortunately, it's going to leave us and our future generations in big difficulty.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Rob.
Well, I'm tempted to change my name to David just to remove any confusion. I'm going to build on David Martin's commentary because it is dire. In the 6 months after the end of the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow, and with the shortages of fuel caused by the Ukraine-Russian war, which in my view is a world war that we're just fighting by proxy at the moment, the world is moving away from where it should be focused in terms of climate change. It's almost like it's doubling down on fossil fuels, which isn't wise at all. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has popped up and openly said the direction we've suddenly gone in is foolish. And rather than doubling down on carbon base fuels, we should be using this as a reason to move off them. But as we often learn in politics, the tactical can often trump the strategic, and that appears to be the case on the world market, where governments seem to have paused their commitments to counter climate change and seem to be doubling down on fossil fuels, which is problematic. We now are tracking pollution levels that exceed pre-COVID-19 events, and that's particularly troubling. So with all of this concern on climate change and what appears to be a worldwide agreement that we need to do something dramatic in the face of a shortage of these fuel sources, we are doing the exact opposite as a planet. Now, there are certainly some governments that are not, and the UN clearly is against this. It's not that members of political elements aren't aware that they aren't doing the right things. It's just that the people that are in power aren't evidently part of those elements, and that's going to be extremely problematic, because the more damage we do quicker, the harder it is going to be to recover from the damage that's done. And as David Martin pointed out, the war in Ukraine is doing a significant amount of climate damage as it's ongoing, and that we haven't had some of the major events that could be even more catastrophic. The destruction of a nuclear power plant, for instance, could be catastrophic in a number of ways to the environment. Not to mention that the generating capacity of that plant will have to be made up by something, and likely by a coal oil-fired generating capability, because building another nuclear plant, it isn't going to happen anytime soon. Certainly not in the Ukraine. So the dire outcome that many of us are concerned about is becoming even more dire because of the tactical approach of governments to try to shore up the existing ecosystem, as opposed to use the war in Ukraine to hard pivot away from it. Now, the economic issues are significant. I think David Smith pointed out some of them, but a good deal of the money that flows into government and a large number of jobs are still supported by the petrochemical industry. And for whatever reason, nobody's really come up with what would be a soft landing for those people or those companies. Some of the firms are trying to pivot to renewable energy, but the shortcomings of wind and solar are well known, and the underlying issue is that energy storage, electrical energy storage, is still problematic. We are looking at a number of very creative approaches, like using weighted elevators and skyscrapers to store energy, or weighted trains on mountains to store energy. But at least to me, they seem to be a very low tech and very high waste, because you still have to deal with a lot of the friction and the physics of moving physical bodies for energy storage. Our future really needs to be something more closely aligned to solid state energy storage, which on paper should be significantly better in terms of the ability to retain energy for long periods of time, and to be able to both capture and release energy in large quantities at a single moment, so it can adapt to changes in the grid instantly. Sadly, that technology has not advanced as many of us have hoped, and leakage remains a significant problem with solid state batteries that has yet to be fully addressed. And so the technologies that we have available for storage, from lead acid to lithium ion to the latest solid state battery capabilities, still are proving inadequate to the task of large scale energy storage, which is required for either wind or solar energy. We're certainly looking at things like capturing the energy out of the ocean, but that raises transport problems because not everybody's close to an ocean, and we lose a lot of energy on transport. And while we've theorized that doing things like placing solar panels over the Sahara Desert, for instance, could supply the world with power, the transmission losses would quickly exceed the ability of that desert to generate. And so our inability to transport energy effectively and efficiently still leads us to this idea of being able to create microgrids and putting energy generation closer to the people that are going to use it. But then we're still back to the kind of energy that they could generate, which is back to solar and wind, which only generate certain times of the day. Solar only during the mid-morning to late afternoon time frames. Wind tend to be early to late afternoon to early evening time frames. And nothing seems to be able to generate energy for us greatly at night other than geothermal. And geothermal is much more expensive to put in place than either solar or wind. So that brings us back to nuclear as being kind of the end all be all, because we know how to do it safely. We know how to do it at scale. It is relatively inexpensive. However, we have run into a lot of problems with regard to spent rod storage, and the fact that nobody wants those rods stored anywhere near where they're living, and so that's an issue that we're looking at with regard to fusion generation, nuclear fusion generation, or going to secondary high yield reactors that then can consume the fuel that the low yield reactors leave behind. All of that is theoretically possible, but expensive to implement. And it does require a strategic government commitment, because you're not going to implement it overnight. It's going to have to be implemented over years. And I'm one of the people not convinced we have years to get this solved. So the problems we've got with competing technologies, with things like spent fuel storage, with the cost of geothermal, we even had a look at artificial petrochemical fuels, so-called clean wet gas, but in consumption, while in production, they can be cleaner. In consumption, not so much. And then we've got a green hydrogen as another alternative that looked like it could go in on top of fuel and displace it, at least using natural gas transport facilities that we already have in place. But the problem is it's a smaller molecule, and the gas transport facilities would simply leak too much. Not to mention the production of hydrogen at scale looks to not be all that green in and of itself, because of the nature of the production facilities. So everything has a counterpoint, whether it be extreme cost, whether it be the safe storage of fuel rods, or just a very complex ecosystem to deal with the problem. The screwy thing is we can do it. It's just a matter of picking a course and getting on it and staying on the course. And that seems to be the thing we are absolutely unwilling to do, because we have too many vested interests either fighting the overall effort in general, or each advocating for its own approach to solving the problem, and thus the problem isn't being solved. And as I mentioned, right now we're going the wrong way. So what needs to happen is we really need to sit down and recognize that we're in deep trouble, and that means we need to come together on a plan. And even if it's not the most perfect plan, as long as it moves the ball significantly in the right direction, and we have enough people to support it, then we can execute and move to execution as quickly as possible, because we really don't have much time. No, we don't have any time left to argue about this anymore. We should be well into implementation, and we are, and fixing that probably should be our highest priority.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Sheridan Tatsuno.
Hi, Sheridan Tatsuno, San Francisco. I'd like to talk about energy supply and demand as the major battle coming for the next century, all right? And it's going to be titanic battle. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be extremely expensive, over $100 trillion or more. And the political leaders who lead will survive. The ones that cannot survive the political heat will probably just step out and retire and get rid of them. All right, so here's what's going on. In the 1970s, this is a repeat, I was involved with the energy industry. I worked for Bechtel and the geotech companies After the OPEC oil shock, we had a crisis, high energy prices, just like today. And I worked on all the projects. I worked on nuclear power plants, siting, uranium mining. I prepared the land use study for the U.S. oil reserves. I worked at the Department of Energy through Bechtel. I also worked with the solar rights for cities in San Bernardino County. And at that point, we weren't very picky. We were just saying any energy is good, like today. We're desperate. And so we looked at everything. All right. Unfortunately, solar and wind were too expensive, so we really couldn't do too much with that back then. So nuclear was the way to go. But then we had Three Mile Island, which really killed us in '79. So that kind of put us kibosh on everything. So basically, we're where we were in 1973 with the oil shock crisis, energy prices going through the roof. Now, Russia learned that whenever there's a war or a crisis, oil prices skyrocket. So this war it's a made up, I call it wag the dog war. Because he learned from the Iraq war and every war before this, whenever there's a war, our energy prices go through the roof. Putin's making about $20 billion a month right now on oil. Okay, so it's 45% of his global GDP. So he's going to keep fighting. Donbass doesn't really matter. I mean, it's a defeat, actually. He hasn't taken Ukraine. The point is that as long as any prices are up there, he's going to be filling his coffers right now with energy, with money. So that's the whole point of his war. And so I think we should be aware of that. Now, that's the battle. It's a political battle fought on a warfront to keep prices artificially high while we're trying to do climate change. Now, this time we have climate change now. So on the other hand, we have the energy producers who have what they call the competency trap. When you spent trillions of dollars investment of training people in oil, which is 80% of our energy around the world, you're not going to quit because that's your job, that's your future. So I don't expect any oil producer or any nation that's compromised and lobbied or by the oil producers to say we're going to just give up and go green. That's a fantasy. They'll never do it. They will fight to the bitter end. All right, because I worked with energy. I know these guys. I know how Houston and Denver and they think, and they are to their benefit. Well, let's say to their credit, they did help build the global economy since 1900. So they could claim that. Without that, we wouldn't have problems. Now, let's go to the demand side, okay? And I'm writing a book. It's coming out in 2 weeks on how cities can save the world. And here's the harsh numbers. Cities consume 80% of all energy as the end-use markets, right? Including industry, everything. And they emit 70% of the carbon or more. They also generate 80% of the revenues for the GDP. So they have the money, okay. But the difference is they're on the demand side. They're the buyers. Whereas the oil producers and the nations are on the sell side. So you have OPEC, which is an energy cartel to promote oil sales. The cities are buyers. They frankly don't care where they get their energy. They're not beholden to oil and gas because they're not bought off by them. So cities right now, the UN, C40, other cities are saying, what can we do? Well, right now they're not organized, but I can tell you, and my book's all about that, how cities can organize, just like the moonshot, over the next 8 years, by 2030, organize a buyers consortium, which companies are already doing. And they can decide politically, in the policies, procurement, zoning. They have total control over everything that goes on in their cities. And they could. Now, here's the problem, though. If they do it tomorrow, let's say the 100 cities announced 80, 90% of this 80, 70%. Wall Street reaction to be enormous because basically you have stranded assets. All oil and gas is stranded assets over time. They can't do it because it would send the globe into a recession or depression. So politically, they're too powerful as buyers. For example, you could have a consumer boycott, for example. Let's say 80% of your customers from a retail company, Walmart, decide to boycott you tomorrow. how long will you survive when you lose 80% of your sales? And that's basically what the power that the cities have over the oil producers. Now, they won't allow that, obviously, because they will fight to stay in business. But I do believe, because I worked with energy, if we do it right, okay, and if the energy industry is smart, and I think they're very smart, they have the engineering talent and the money, they could transfer from being what I call commodity sellers of cheap gas and oil, or used gas and oil, to becoming smart renewable energy producers and solutions. In other words, their business looks like a little bit less like the coal industry going under and more like Apple Computer. And what do I mean by Apple Computer? It's a full stack. You not only provide the batteries, the storage, the power, the generation, everything. You provide the software, the services, the apps, products, everything. And frankly, I think if the energy companies were smart, they would shift over to being a full stack provider because they have the technology and the know-how, and they could make much more money than they are now. And one problem with oil, I could tell you right off the bat, it goes up and down, it's volatile. In the early 80s, if you remember this, 1982 to 86, I worked for Bechtel. Oil prices crashed from $40 to $10 a barrel, destroyed everything. Everybody says electric vehicles, not batteries. No, it destroyed the oil industry. Denver and Houston were ghost towns. Bechtel laid off 2/3 of our teams because everything was destroyed, urban planning, everything. When the next crash comes in oil, the same thing will happen. All right. Now, the question is, and the problem is, we could take advantage of the oil prices being high to invest in renewables because it's financially feasible. But if we wait till the crash, it's going to be hard again because that's what killed the renewables last time, is cheap oil and gas. So we have a very short window. I think actually, I'll say it this way, in the way Putin's doing us a favor, I hate to say this, and here's why. He's making us aware that we're vulnerable, except this time we have the climate threat over our head. Last time we didn't know about it because Exxon covered it up. Right. We have a chance now, while energy prices are high, to move all as much money as we can into renewables, because at some point, energy prices are going to collapse again, and we won't be able to do it because it's not going to be economically viable for anybody. They'll just go to cheap gas again, like we did back in the 80s with Reagan. So I think it's a timing problem right now. So I think, so I'm writing the book and how we could do it over the next 10 years. And the 3 phases, how 10,000 cities, which is 95% of the 80% of energy consumption, that's about 75% of all oil and gas, can shift over to renewables. Now, to get to the technology, I'll keep it, and is besides solar and wind, which is kind of interim, we have geothermal, but not the deep spring stuff, even though they have it, is I'll call heat exchangers. Back in 1970s, I was housing planner, and Rifle, Colorado, what they did is they put piping underground, and they put liquids underground to reduce the temperatures when, because interiors went from like minus 20 to 140 degrees inside the houses in Colorado. And so what they did is they used insulation and they ran the water and they had passive heating, and they were able to lower and moderate the temperatures from 70 to 80, 90 degrees. And then they applied solar and wind. So that's what we could do. And the good thing about, we call it the subsoil geothermal, it's global. Everywhere, the Earth is one gigantic battery, energy battery. So anywhere over 10 feet below the ground, it's stable year round. So for example, tropical countries could just put underground in and use the Earth to cool down the interiors with good insulation. But we don't do that. Now, the good part about that, it's a local decentralized source. It would create tens of millions of jobs in construction, finance, piping, passive design, architecture, engineering, and it does not rely on governments, national governments, or the oil industry. Just local people can do it. You don't need the oil industry, anybody to do it. You can just do it yourself with your local people. The other opportunity, which is kind of a question mark, is that lithium is in the oceans, but it's expensive to get out right now. One discovery Japan made 3 years ago is a rare earth deposit off the coast. which has 700 to 1,000 years of rare earth materials for batteries. In other words, Japan, if they did it right, could become the richest nation in the world if they want to. But the problem is that under the sea, you have the mining, and it disturbs the bottom of the ocean. So we would have to have very efficient, clean ways of pulling the rare earths out of the bottom with some sort of suction and robots and all to just not disturb the bottom. But anyway, so we have that. And they could do it if we want. So we have the energy in the earth and rare earth, deep sea. The question is, is political, environmental. Do we really want to do it? Or do we want to just keep relying? I mean, I'll just be frank, it's a no-brainer. Do we want to keep relying on oil and gas and national leaders and international leaders who are bought by them? It's like saying we're going to a cliff, we're just going to accelerate as fast as we can off the cliff. That's like insanity in my mind. So I think we have a chance. We have a lot of technical options and political options, but the good part is we have the cities, and the good thing about cities is that they're distributed, they're closer to the people, and if you don't like them, you can vote them out of office. So that's why I think that the climate activists and the leaders don't realize the power that if they pressure the cities at the local level, they could change all the cities literally in 1 year. 1 year. It doesn't take 50 years to change a mayor. You can get them out of office really quickly. So that's my thing. And so I'm writing the book. It'll be coming out in a couple of weeks. But I do have a lot of hope that our humans are wiser than we think they are when given the right leadership. And I think that, we have enough awareness now in science, technology, and online that we could move very fast, especially the young people. They can move in real time. So I'm really hopeful that we could do that. But it's multi-generational, because we're going to need all the experts here in this room to guide the young people in what doesn't work and what works. But anyway, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Donald.
Hi. Well, everybody's just done an excellent job of laying everything out. It's always nice to hear everybody. I've been reading about something else about the climate issue. This week's Economist said that we've reached the highest CO2 levels ever, which is not surprising. It just keeps going up. There's no ceiling on where we're going to go to that, and of course the CO2 is the kind of trigger greenhouse gas that causes the temperatures to keep rising. It's been pretty hot here for June, and I think that we're going to have a very hot summer. As others have mentioned, the climate change is already here. There was an interesting article in The Economist about Miami and how it's pretty much hopeless that city can continue because the sea levels are rising for the water in the water table, so that there's salt water in the water, and so it'll basically run out of fresh water. Besides the fact that the sea levels are starting to wash into the streets and into the cities, it'll be just a matter of years before some of the cities in the United States just won't be habitable anymore. Houston, Miami, a few others. So yeah, I'm agreeing with what. See, if I say I'm agreeing with what David said, I'm agreeing with what pretty much everybody on the panel said. So, because we've got so many Davids. But and anyway, in any event, what I've been reading about is that the distribution of pain from climate change is extremely unfairly distributed, and the less educated you are, the poorer you are, the more likely it is that climate change is going to be hurting you. And so if we look at the world and we look at the economic development of countries, the countries that are getting hit hardest are often countries with with very low economic development. So Bangladesh is a country that's in deep trouble because it's so low to sea level. As the sea levels are rising right now, Bangladesh is a lot more threatened than some of other countries. And one of the interesting things that's been starting to happen is that people are starting to sue the fossil fuel industry in the United States and actually make progress at it. And that goes to what Sheridan is saying, is one of the entities that are doing that is cities. They're suing the fossil fuel industry as nuisances that are actually harming their cities, and these suits are going forward. The courts aren't throwing them out. They're saying they're agreeing that the cities do have standing to do this. And so if you just look at corporations as mindless, I think is a way to think about it. And their purpose is to create value for their shareholders, not for their stakeholders, for their shareholders. And so their effectiveness is measured in terms of the amount of dollars that they return to the people who own them. And that's the only benchmark in the United States that's used, that's officially used. I mean, some corporations try and do other things and look at stakeholder value and things like that, and look at triple bottom line and things like that. But with the oil companies, it's just a matter of like, how much money are we making for our, and so one way to possibly change their behavior is to basically make it cost more money for them to have bad behavior. And so these lawsuits are starting to happen all across the world in different countries. And it's very important that it happens in the United States because this is the headquarters to several of the really large, Chevron, Exxon Mobil, but of course Shell is a European company, so it needs to happen all across the world. BP is European or British anyway. It used to be Europe. They seceded from Europe, but so I agree. I really agree, and I think there was a wonderful talk I heard by I forget what her role was, but she's I think the current leader of the European Union right now, and she was talking about how critical it was to get off of fossil fuels, and how much of the problem that they're having right now is because they're on fossil fuels. So I agreed with something that Sheridan said, which is that as bad as the war in Ukraine is, there is one silver lining in it, which is that it's made very, very clear that the fact that Europe is dependent on the fossil fuels from Russia is a very weak point for them. It's something that's turned out to be a huge problem for them, and the solution can't be to become dependent on fossil fuels from someplace else, because every time you do that, you're putting yourself right back in the same position. And so they up their amount of money that they're spending on renewables. But as that goes, what Rob was saying is that how we store and save the energy from renewables is still not completely worked out. I think that I know that in Europe they are repurposing some of the natural gas pipelines to be able to use hydrogen, and they have to be fixed because, as Rob says, it's harder to contain the hydrogen in the pipelines, but they are doing that. So hydrogen's one way, but as others have said, we have to try lots of different things. And one of the things that Sheridan pointed out about cities is something that I'm very big on. I read a book once called The Triumph of the City, and he said cities are humankind's greatest invention. And he makes a very persuasive argument that that's the case. If you go to cities, the windows that they have in skyscrapers lose a tremendous amount of energy. And so just doing things like replacing all the windows in skyscrapers with more heat efficient windows and things like that can have a significant impact on the amount of energy that cities use. So, but because cities are like concentrated, you can focus on solutions inside of cities to lower the energy use of cities. Cars are very inefficient. Public transportation is far more efficient. You can continue along the lines of incrementally lowering the use in cities. So the thing that I think that kind of would be nice to be able to work out is the whole question of, I would say, climate justice, and trying to realize that right now the people that are getting affected by it the most are the least able to change the direction of the way things are going. And I think that we're gonna continue to see through lawsuits is one way that gives them power, but if people don't get power in that way, I'm afraid that we're going to start seeing more and more situations where people are going to start doing whatever they can. And so one of the consequences of climate change is going to be more wars and other kinds of problems that we're already starting to see. And it's extremely urgent. And but the people who are affected by it the least are the people who are it's most necessary to do the change. And since they're affected by it the least, they're the ones who are the least willing to do something about it. So we're kind of in a bind right now. It's a dangerous time.
Thank you. Thank you. I have to go for concluding remarks for today's session. First, Mr. David Schumacher.
What a great discussion. Sheridan, thanks so much for the information about cities. I look forward to reading them. And those and others who have commented about cities. I want to take us back to politics where I started, which is in politics, it seems like it takes an immediate bad thing to create some kind of change to move us towards something good. It's really hard for politics to look down the road and work in long range terms, or at least that's been my observation. So I'll take it back to what a couple of people have said about bad news maybe being good news, whether that's bad news of the war driving oil prices higher or exposing supply line issues or whatever that bad news is. It then energizes the populace and politicians to make some kind of change. As I said before, I have no illusions to these changes making things better once and for all, but if we can have some incremental change, that would be a step in the right direction. Not only politics, but bad news is also good for innovation. When there are a lot of bad things being talked about, people become concerned, and there becomes markets for innovators that didn't necessarily exist before. Being able to increase resiliency for areas where there's flooding or wildfires is a market that's being created that didn't really exist before. Now there are others as well, but those are obvious ones that I want to point out. So maybe politics and innovation can help more in the short run. Fortunately, there are some countries, though, that are taking the long-range view, and they're doing it for their own best interest. Denmark, for example, with their power islands that you may have read about. Denmark produces a lot of fossil fuel oil from the North Sea and has been selling that. But they realize that there is a shelf life for how long they can continue to do that. And they've been developing these islands, two to begin with, that are strategically located to be able to provide not only power for them, but for other European countries, so that they hope to be able to pivot and be able to start selling green energy to other countries that maybe can't do it as much for themselves. So I applaud places that are looking to make the changes that need to be made that are in their best interest and hopefully in the best interest of others as well. And perhaps we'll see that with cities. I really want to take a look at that. I live in maybe the hottest city in the United States, Phoenix, Arizona. We have 40-degree temperatures are the norm, and I'm talking Celsius. 40-degree temperatures are the norm in the summertime here. And they'll go much higher than that. They'll go up to about 45 or so. And we're getting more and more of those days every year. That's the bad news that can drive perhaps political change and innovation. I'm experiencing that where I live, and perhaps that will help energize other areas as well. So I'll keep my concluding remarks short and I'll stop there.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Mr. David Smith.
I would like to jump right on what David said too, is that there's areas where we see hope for climate change, particularly as we look at the ways technology can assist with helping mitigate part of that. The different ways we can begin to use power, the solar, the wind, actually geothermal in some places have been ways to go there, but we're seeing more. I met a couple of weeks ago with a company that uses kinetic energy to charge batteries and then connect those batteries to the grid. And it's interesting. They have contracts in the United States in Minneapolis and in Amarillo, Texas, which are junctions on train tracks across big regions. And they are putting a couple of cars on each train that as they move, the kinetic energy from their things in the wheel axle charge the batteries. And when they get to the cities, they lift them up and plug into the grid. The impact of that on the train is almost nothing. They're also doing it with 18-wheelers as a way to generate power using things that we have today and plugging into the grid in different places. Yes, do the other twos burn fossil fuel? Yes, they do. But on the other hand, we're beginning to get energy out of it and beginning to mitigate part of that. We've seen other places where using tidal motion in water bodies, particularly the oceans, can generate power. I'm going to go back to one that is very interesting, and that is the use of nuclear power in part of the mix. What is really funny for me is you see people like the climate activist Greta Thunberg say that any of these alternative power, particularly if it involves radioisotopes, fusion, or nuclear power, they are fake climate action. So, David, just like some of the things you said earlier about the debates in our congressional side and the politics side, we see the same thing with even climate activists when we look at different ways to begin to solve the problem. One of the nuclear technologies that I have been following a lot lately, and to me, it has great promise, and it's called molten salt reactors. And what a molten salt reactor is instead of using discrete uranium cores in a reactor, what this is this is irradiated salt that is used as the element to generate the heat to turn the turbines and the steam there. Uh, the comparing it to the ability to just to take and clean up the nuclear rods, much lower threshold, much more stable reactor. There are already multiple of these being built in companies like in Asia and others. China's building a molten salt reactor for power. I think we're going to begin to push technology more. Today, over 20% of the worldwide electricity is generated from nuclear reactors, which is a figure I was surprised to see it was that high. But I think we have to look at the range of things, and we're beginning to see it. There's been a lot of advancement in the last 3 years on fusion reactors. So it's how our sun generates its power and energy. We're beginning to look at them, but we're looking at them not just in large scale, where they would be attached to the grid and distributed, but the whole concept of microcells. I want to throw back on the table. Microcells have the ability to utilize the appropriate green technology where they are. So, for example, the kinetic battery train trucks are excellent for attaching to a microcell. So if I'm a manufacturing plant, I could conceivably use those for all of my energy as a microcell, a microgrid, when I have my product shipping in and out of the railroads or with trucks. And it's just beginning to get creative. We have so many creative people that as we begin to use group intelligence, we begin to look at alternative ways to deploy technology and alternative ways to cross industry boundaries and look at what is done in one industry, how it can be applied in another one, and create the synergies by the synthesis of that information coming together. That's where we're going to create the breakthroughs that will let us really work to solve climate change. So, Sharif, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Mr. David Martin.
So very happy to participate in this forum which amazingly has no climate deniers in it. I don't know how that happened because they still exist. I actually come from Calgary, Canada, which is an oil city. And I know some climate deniers, even in close friends and family. So we're not fully out of the woods in terms of getting those people on board with climate change, which is the subject of this conversation today. But at least everybody here is and had some very interesting points, and I enjoyed listening to it all. It's funny how we move from climate change onto technology change, which seemed to become the main subject. But the reality is still climate change, and India with 55 degrees, and I don't know, Pakistan similar, and even a Canadian city burned down last summer in the forest of British Columbia, which is totally unheard of and devastated me because I had never imagined that in my lifetime, to see a Canadian city burn through a forest fire. So it's good that people are aware of these things. And I think really what we need to start talking about is how the world is going to change, because it is changing and changing. Technology can help, but people are going to be migrating. Even Americans are leaving the heat and buying places in Canada now because they don't want to live down in those places like Phoenix and Austin, which are too hot or getting hotter. So we're going to see all of these changes. And this is what really we have to accept: the idea climate change is here, it's happening. Technology can help, but remember, it's all based on minerals, and minerals are going up in price. Metals are getting more expensive, so even wind turbines are going to go up. Sometimes technology goes down in price, but a lot of the technology and infrastructure building nuclear power plants is going to go up in price because they're based on very valuable resources in the world just to build them. So it's not going to be easy. It's going to take huge amounts of investment. And there's going to be huge changes. For example, if you like a good Bordeaux wine, you might as well buy a few bottles today, because in a few years, they might not be making it anymore down there. And so those shadows are going to go out of business. So enjoy your Bordeaux today. You might not have good wine from France in a few more years when the temperature's up. And even champagne might be off the books, and they'll be making it in Denmark. So that's what I'm going to leave you to think about. And thanks for all your good ideas to think about as well.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Rob.
Well, in that last comment, I want to point out that Oregon's willing to step up. The Oregon wine industry, which I've invested a little bit in, is perfectly willing to step in and supplement France's failing wine prospects. I'm sure they're excited about that change. Anyway, seriously, the closing remarks. The issue, as David pointed out, that we're in bold agreement with regard to the fact that climate change is real. I still think global warming is probably the better term, because that's mostly what's happening. But it does vary across the globe. The issue is that we've got typically two sides to this. They've got the side that is the climate deniers, with the easy message of just keep the core status quo. Why change something that isn't broken? Of course, we kind of agree that it is broken, so it does need to be changed. But it's a relatively easy argument. It's simple. And then on the climate change side, we have a lot of different ideas and conflicting opinions about what the heck should be done, and that makes for a much more complex argument. Not to mention, we still haven't really solved the energy storage problem, and recognize the reason we haven't is because between about 1920 and 1970, battery development was non-existent. We had mostly decided that lead acid was as good as we were going to get, and except for some more advanced technologies that were used in aircraft and in the space program, which was also operating about 20 years behind technology, we just didn't see the need for advanced batteries. And then, of course, we had electronics. Electronics age started, and suddenly we did need batteries, and battery development went vertical. But the problem is we're making up for nearly a century of a lack of development and energy storage, and so we're chasing this thing from well behind it, and it just showcases the need to approach these problems strategically, to think about future issues we know that are coming, and put in place, and that's what government is supposed to do, put in place programs to mitigate them, so that the populace never has to experience what the populace is experiencing, which are large forest fires, major heat events, the loss of massive amounts of farmland, and large migrations of people from areas that no longer can support them to areas that for now can, but in many cases may not be able to support those people in the future as populations move to colder climates, and those colder climates become harder and harder to find. Looking at Russia, given where they are in terms of temperature, climate change kind of works for them. That things get warmer. A lot of their land, which is currently in areas which are too cold to farm right now, are going to get warmer and become more viable. So I can certainly understand why Russia, even thinking strategically, isn't a big fan of trying to mitigate climate change, because it's at least over the near term, it's working for them and not going to hurt them as much as it's going to hurt areas that are tropical and subtropical today, and those areas are going to be destroyed. In the end, it really does require a global approach to the problem, and probably the elimination of a lot of the influence that the petrochemical industry has on the different political interests, because there's a lot of money there, and money does talk, and it's causing folks to fight change that they know is necessary, but they believe is not in their own short-term best interest. And so there lies the difficulty. And for the folks that are proposing solutions, they need to think through the solutions so that the solutions are viable if they are implemented. For instance, I'll be talking later on today on radio about the Biden plan to put in chargers at every 50-mile increments all over the nation, which sounds great, except a good chunk of the nation has large portions of freeways that aren't near any generation source. Just out in the middle of nowhere. And the states that have those are asking, well, what do we do? I mean, it's the money we're getting could allow us to put them in, but they're going to be unprofitable. And so who's going to support them? And so I've got this view of a few years from now, we're going to have a lot of these stations. They'll be rusting. They will not work because they weren't profitable, and the money wasn't put aside to assure that somebody's going to maintain these damn things once they're put in place. And so the thinking through this, we need a strategic solution, and the strategic solution needs to be implemented strategically. It will do us no good to put this stuff in and have it fail. It will set everybody back. And so the approach should be to prioritize remedies that can stand the test of time. And right now, putting charging stations 50 miles apart without some type of variance isn't. I mean, to give you an idea, for some of the charging stations that have been put in place away from infrastructure, they're being powered by diesel generators, which isn't green at all. But it's still a hell of a lot cheaper than running high power lines to them, or setting up a huge solar field and dropping in large lithium-ion backup batteries, which would make them even less profitable, given that there aren't right now a whole lot of electric cars on the road, and those cars that are on the road are probably not on these stretches of highways where they have low charger densities. And so you can't get the profitability that way. A better path would certainly be to focus on cities where you've got generating capacity in abundance, and figure out a way to charge these cars when they're waiting in parking spaces. And we do have inductive technology that can do that. You can bear it in roads. And we also know that electrical vehicles work far better in cities than they do in rural areas, because of the strength of electrical vehicles is that they work better in traffic than they do on large high-speed trips. And so focus on the areas where they work best and where you've got energy density, and you can put in place chargers that address the problem and allow large population areas to make the conversion early. And if the rural areas stay on gas, it's not going to be a huge problem. If the cities stay on gas, it will be. So focus where you can do the greatest good for the lowest cost and make that happen, as opposed to trying to do everything at once everywhere, which never seems to work. So this lack of strategic approach to the problem by those that support these approaches is just as problematic as those folks that are fighting it, because failure at scale is going to set us back. And the goal has to be to make this as successful as possible, as fast as possible. And that means we have to look at the economics of this and assure profitability throughout the process. And if we don't, it's not going to work. We'll just get another political party in power that will point to the failures of the prior efforts, and those efforts will stall. So thinking through this is a strategic problem. We just need a strategic solution, and it has to be viable end to end. And that means we need to prioritize how we do this and do it in the areas where we'll have the greatest impact for the lowest overall cost. It's not about fairness. It's about making this work. And in the end, I really doubt we're going to do more than complain about this over time and watch us ping pong back and forth before the problem becomes dire. And that is problematic.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Sharidan Tatsuno.
Okay. All right. Very good. Yeah. Just following up on Rob. One thing I do notice that people tend to be very pragmatic around the world, whether it's cities, governments, citizens. And, one thing we learned is that people are not married to energy sources. For example, we used to use whale oil a long time ago, and I believe, and we kind of ditched that really fast when coal showed up. And then we had coal, we still have it, but, we noticed that Coal is rather dirty and messy, so we kind of ditched that. We also had nuclear, and after a couple of meltdowns and things that, the public really doesn't like toxic waste forever, 10,000 years. So, we tend to be very pragmatic when a better solution comes along. So right now we're moving beyond oil and gas. So the car makers are already ramping up, not on combustion cars, they were electric vehicles, Ford, GM, everybody, right? Utilities, they don't frankly care whether it's green or fossil fuel driven energy. They're just trying to sell energy, period. Doesn't matter where it comes from. So they're not married to oil and gas either. And cities aren't either, because they're buyers. They want clean energy, so they're buying. So all I'm saying is that one thing, if you look at history, humans are pragmatic. We need energy, we know that. But we're willing to ditch old, dirty, dangerous energy for cleaner, better solutions. And typically, if you look at, we go from dumb energy to smart energy, which means much more refined and processed and demanding more intelligence, like smart grids. And so I don't worry, actually, Frank, Silicon Valley, there's $120 trillion in ESP funds, right? And you got Silicon Valley. Do you seriously think they're not going to try to get into smart grids where they can load up everything with smart processes, and software and everything? I mean, Apple Computer could literally go in there and become a smart grid producer and make trillions of dollars over the next 20 years. So, I don't think that the oil guys are going to do it. I think they're too bought into the old system, like coal guys. They'll go under with the coal. But the smart people, and these are heavily technology-driven people, have the money and the smarts. And any oil company that's smart is going to go with the tech boys, because they have the money and they know how to develop smart grids. For example, we could take geothermal, just for in the Rockies, we could run power lines. I did it 40 years ago with Bechtel to LA and San Francisco. We could do them underground if we had to, which is what PG&E's doing now. So I don't worry about can we do it? Yeah, we can do it. We have the technology, we have the money. It's just political will and then the legislation to do it now. So I think if you look at, and I don't want to use the word geoengineering because it has a dirty word, but this is geoengineering, but it's more practical. So for example, the Sahara could be the biggest supplier of solar energy to Europe. If the cities just say, okay, we're going to buy from you, and then actually Greece, Italy, Turkey, and other countries would have huge amounts of open land. They could just put solar collectors and sell straight to Europe. And the cities could cut deals with the countries to source it. So solar, for the global south, the other one is green hydrogen. And here's why they could use the solar there to produce green hydrogen, which they can then ship to Europe or the United States or other countries. And so basically, global south could be a net energy exporter of green hydrogen, just as the Sahara's net energy exporter of solar. And then you could have other cities, then the geothermal, that could be also through smart grids, long grids. Right now, the US, for example, doesn't have enough long distance grids that are smart. So we could but that's just a problem of investment and timing. The other thing nobody's talking about is using solar for heating, district heating. So for example, the other thing that besides hot, for the solar, you could have pipelines, water pipelines with hot water going from Italy and Greece to Germany. And because they already have district heating and cooling now, so just pipe the hot water there, 180, 200 degree, and then insulate it to the northern cities using solar from the south. So, and water pipelines are easy to put in because they don't spill toxic waste. So it'd be easy to get approvals for water pipelines. So I think we have a lot of solutions that we could do if we want to. I don't think, and I think that we need to look at technology in all areas and not exclude anything, because we just don't know where the breakthroughs are going to be. But I think people are incredibly creative and inventive, and from the top to the bottom, everywhere. And so I think we just need to be open to innovation, because that's how we survived as humans. That's why we have a brain. And I think if we do that, we work together, but it's not going to be one solution. It'll be many, many solutions across the board. we'll figure out how to do it. And I'm encouraged by the young people I meet. They are so smart and driven nowadays and educated compared to when I was a kid. I feel like an idiot compared to many of these kids nowadays. So I'm very hopeful that with the right guidance from our leadership here, with the young people, I think we could pull it off. This is thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Mr. Donald, what's your concluding remarks?
David Martin, we have had climate deniers on the show. We actually had somebody from the Heartland Foundation once. That curled my blood, but Sharif knows better than to have them on with the rest of us. So, one of the arguments that they constantly make, and it speaks to something that Sheridan has said, is that they make it into an all or none, black and white situation. And one of their main arguments that they make is that all of the world's great, wonderful technology is powered by energy. The energy comes from fossil fuels. If we stopped using fossil fuels, we wouldn't have the energy. All of our technology would stop working. The world would come to an end. All of the people in the developing world deserve to have the energy resources that the developed world had. So it's absolutely unconscionable to talk about using less fossil fuel, because then places like India and other places that are developing won't have the energy resources that they need to develop. And so that's why we have to use fossil fuels. That's kind of the basis for the main argument that they make. But that goes immediately to what Sheridan and everyone, Rob and David and everybody have said, which is that there are a lot of different technologies that we can be using, and it's a matter of will. One of the things that people often say, for example, is that people complain, they say, well, solar only works in the day and wind is intermittent. Well, okay, that may be the case. So let's just say you're using, like we do here, natural gas in California is the main way that we make electric. So, but during the day, we can offset the amount of natural gas we use by solar. And the main time that you use energy is during the day. So, okay, let's just say we can't completely eliminate using natural gas, but by using solar and wind, we can reduce it by 50%. That's a huge win. If we all of a sudden start using half as much, we cut down the amount of petroleum we're using by 50%. That's starting to make a real difference. And I live in Palo Alto, and Palo Alto's has been for decades, at least a decade and more, carbon neutral. And about, I guess 5 years ago or something, they hooked up to a grid in the Central Valley, where they started buying solar from the Central Valley. And as a consequence, they were buying power, or actually even selling power for 3.4 cents a kilowatt, which was the cheapest power in the United States. And there it is, one of the certainly 10 and probably 5 richest cities in the entire country. And they have the cheapest power. And that's possible for any city. And it's a matter of all of us starting to think of like these incremental steps. If we can reduce it 10% here and 5% here, and we're reducing it. And it's, as everyone's brought up, the will has to be there. And I'm hoping that by a combination of education and people starting to understand it, and I love the idea of lawsuits and other kinds of things where we start trying to force basically force the cost. It's basically in economics, there's the idea of an externality, which is the idea that if you create waste, and instead of taking it to the garbage dump, you dump it on your neighbors, it's cheaper for you. So you can make your product less expensively because you don't have the expense of taking your garbage to the garbage dump, and so therefore you can make more profit. But that's an externality, and pollution is an externality where you're basically dumping your garbage on other people. So the fossil fuel industry is basically making money by dumping their garbage on other people. And in the United States, we're actually subsidizing that. And so we have to, people have to start fighting. I mean, we're starting to fight that. It's not just a matter of technology. It's also a matter of us becoming aware and realizing that it's something that we can do something about. It's something that we have to do. It has to be incremental, but we also have to be aware that there are extremely powerful people and interests right now that are trying to prevent us from doing it. So, and we do have the power to actually start forcing them to pay for the problems that they're causing and hopefully change their behavior.
Thank you everyone. This is excellent discussion. I request all of our audience, especially those who from academia and industry, you can share our content with your audience. And yes, this is the way we are actually creating awareness in developing nations with the help of developed world. Thank you, Mr. David Schumacher, Mr. David Smith, Mr. David Martin, Mr. Rob, Mr. Donald, and Mr. Sheridan Tatsuno for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum. Thank you, bye-bye, and take care.